welcome to Film Strip. These podcasts are spoiler-filled as we discuss the plots, characters, and themes of the films in review. All content used or discussed in these podcast episodes is the property of the respective owners and used under the Fair Use Act, Section 504, C2, Title 17.
Welcome to Film Strip. I'm Jay.
And I'm Nate.
And this is our review of Days of Thunder, starring Tom Cruise, Robert Duvall, Nicole Kidman, Michael Rooker, John C. Reilly, Cary Elwes, and Randy Quaid. Directed by Tony Scott, produced by Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer, released in 1990 on a budget of $55 million, grossed $157 million at the box office, another $40 million in rentals. Nate, I have distinct memories of seeing this thing in 1990, but I want to know your story with Days of Thunder.
All right, so I gotta put some background on this. This movie came out in 1990. In 1990, I was 14 years old. I worked, when I was 14 years old, that summer, I worked in a pit crew at the local speedway down in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. That's where I learned to change a tire, index spark plugs. Everything I know about a car, I learned from working in it was at the very bottom level of racing. I mean, I'm telling you, these are just guys that... This is just something to do for fun. The car's wrecked all the time. But I worked in this pit crew that whole racing season. And so growing up in South Carolina, I grew up an hour away from Darlington. And NASCAR was my absolute favorite sport, really all the way up until Tony Stewart retired. And after he retired, because I grew up, Richard Petty was my guy. Then it was Darrell Waltrip. And then I got out of it for a little while. And then when Tony Stewart came along, I really liked him. And then when he got out, then I was just done. The sport had just changed too much. So when I saw this movie come out, you got to keep in mind I was 14. I had been watching NASCAR since I was a little kid. I had all the Hot Wheels. In fact, I've got my Days of Thunder Hot Wheels right over here that I still have out that I'm going to bring over. But, I was really excited about this. I remember seeing the trailer as a kid in the movie theater. And was really excited to see what this was about. And let's just say it was interesting. It was, so that's sort of my history of this movie. I've seen it many times since. There are a lot of things about the movie I love, love, love. It's a nostalgia thing. It's really the only somewhat NASCAR movie that's not a comedy.
Yeah.
But as Richard Petty did say, the only thing the movie got right were the numbers on the sides of the car.
We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So, my memories of this, I grew up a NASCAR fan as well. My brother's 5 years older than me. He and I grew up watching Bobby Allison and Davey Allison and, Darrell Waltrip and Rusty Wallace try to kill each other at the Winston, 500 and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we just grew up with NASCAR being in Alabama, and Talladega was, our track, right? And so it was a big deal. And so when we found out they were making this movie, we both had loved Top Gun, and we were kind of into Cruise and stuff. And like you, the only NASCAR movies that had been made were kind of a joke. I mean, you had Stroker Ace with Burt Reynolds, which is funny, but it's not really good NASCAR. No. The racing sequences are pretty good. Or you had Six Pack with Kenny Rogers, which has a good song, and Diane Lane, but that's about it. I mean, that was
really it at that time.
Yeah, you had nothing. And since this, you haven't really gotten any more good ones. We got Talladega Nights, which is freaking hilarious and is a pretty good look at race culture, but it's almost a spoof of Days of Thunder. Mm-hmm. So when this was coming out, this was a big deal. And this is the last movie I saw in theaters with my brother before he went to college. Oh. Like the weekend before we were taking him up to college in New York. At West Point, he was like, we need to go see this thing. So he and I went to the theater together. And this was a big deal. Like, I was 14. So getting my 18-year-old brother to pay attention to me at all was a big deal. At that point, it's just how it goes, right? But he and I remember going to see this together. And it was we just sat there and just ate it up, right? I had the Nintendo game, if you remember that thing.
I do remember that game, yeah.
Impossible to beat that game. It is nuts. It's one of those just now I wish I could go back and play it. I might could do it. But anyway, I remember growing up with that and just being so into this. And then, you had everything in this movie. You had all the race stuff. I knew who Robert Duvall was. I just ate him up. I thought he was great.
Oh, yeah.
Randy Quaid was such a presence. I didn't know who Cary Elwes was at the time. I would learn it later. John C. Reilly, of course, having such a long career now, but this is early. Michael Rooker was always the scary bad guy, and from things. And then Nicole Kidman, who I didn't know at the time, but fell in love with at that moment.
Oh, yeah.
How could you not?
That made me, yes, exactly. Absolutely. I was like, ooh, red hair. I didn't know I had a thing for red hair until just now.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's a thing. And so anyway, it was all of that stuff at once. You had Tony Scott, who I was aware of at that point. I had become aware of directors and styles and stuff. And I was like, this, I mean, and the knock on this thing at the time was one, that it's not realistic to NASCAR, yada, yada. And that it's just Top Gun in NASCAR, and we're going to talk about that as we get through this. But I think it's funny that on the day we were recording this, to pull the curtain back a little bit, we've just had a race at Talladega with a very similar finish.
That's true,
the races in this movie, with a huge crash and people swinging around each other on the outside and people trading paint all day. And they say NASCAR isn't like this. I mean, the thing about it was, I think it revealed a lot about NASCAR that NASCAR wasn't ready to admit about yourself. It's almost like pulling the curtain back on wrestling before they were ready to admit kayfabe, or break it.
Yeah.
And it was a little too much. Now, it does simplify a lot of things. And having now lived in Charlotte for a few years and been around the race culture that is here, and when I say the race culture, we're talking about like NASCAR Central.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the headquarters, the Hall of Fame. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And where the cars are built and stuff. That is a very complicated process that gets boiled down to Robert Duvall like praying over pieces of metal in this movie. But that's also not totally out of character for like old NASCAR. And this was right at the point when NASCAR began to change.
Yes.
And began to become what it is now.
Right.
And I remember thinking years later to myself, when Jeff Gordon came onto the scene, people hated on him the way people hated on the Cole Trickle character, because he wasn't from the South.
That's right.
He was a little smart, cocky guy who ran open wheels and then came down here and dominated the sport.
Yeah, and from California, no less, just like Cole Trickle. Yeah, well, it depends on when you ask him where he's from. Sometimes he claims Indiana, sometimes he claims California, so yeah.
Right. Point is, he's not from South Georgia.
Right, exactly.
Or where a lot of these other guys are from. And it's funny. I think the funny thing about NASCAR is, if you go back to its roots history, and this is what makes the sport so Southern, is it's bootleggers souping up their cars, and in between runs, they would just pull off into the woods and race each other.
Yeah.
It's drag racers. It's just guys in their Lincolns and their Fords tricking them out so they can outrun the cops.
Yeah.
And the fact that becomes a sport, only America could we come up with something like that.
It absolutely brilliant. And it's funny. That's exactly. I think that's why NASCAR appealed to me. It had a regional identity. It had a very unique history. It was, and I think that's why it appealed to me growing up in the South. And it was always frustrating. I never got to go to a lot of NASCAR races, despite being only an hour away, because my dad was he was into drag racing. So it was sometimes torture, which I enjoyed as a kid, but it was also sometimes torture because the drag racing speedway, the IRTRA Speedway, was right across the street from Darlington Speedway. And I would just sit there, one day I want to go. And that Darlington did end up being my very first NASCAR race, and I've seen several since. But it was,
cool.
I will say that as I sat down and watched this movie, a lot of things came back to me. Like, yes, the movie had some flaws. And even at 14, I was sitting there in the theater, okay, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, at 14. But I had the Days of Thunder poster on my wall. I still have the Days of Thunder Hot Wheel cars, which it still holds a part of my heart because I have them out. They're on my bookshelf over here, along with my Optimus Prime. And it meant more to me than I thought it did. And I think you're right. I think it did pull back some of that. Hey, this is actually what NASCAR is. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, when they were making the film, they did their research. Randy Quaid's character is patterned off of Rick Hendrick.
Yeah, I mean, they had Rick Hendrick giving them cars, building race cars for them. They had a lot of input. And it should be said, Don Simpson was a race car guy, and he loved to run street cars and race cars and stuff like that. And this whole thing started because Tom Cruise and Paul Newman became friends on the Color Money set, and they got to go drive a real race car. And Tom Cruise just became enamored with this thing and said, I want to write a story. So he went to Robert Towne. They created this whole thing. And then he went to Simpson and Bruckheimer and said, I've got your next movie. Here's how it needs to go. And it's really the first time Cruise started to use his clout as an actor to get something made.
Right,
I mean, he gets story credit on this. He really should get co-producing credit too. And I mean, since then, we've seen what he's done with his productions. He definitely has a lot of hand in his, I say action-oriented career, and I think he's done some in his drama career too, but really his action-oriented career, he's guiding the ship. I mean, if you like the Mission Impossible movies, it's because you like what Tom Cruise says they need to be.
Right.
And he figured that out. And so Anyway, I think that's neat, though, that it was the first time I really realized like that a star could really get something made.
Mm-hmm.
It was when I first really started to dig into movies and learn about them and how they were made and stuff like that. And so I don't know. I've always had a soft spot for this one. But it had been a while since I'd seen it. And when we were kicking around stuff to do, I mean, Nate, you were a guest on the Battle Beyond the Stars show, which is a fantastic show earlier this year in 2020. You're now a full cast member. So I said, okay, Nate, what do you want to be your first movie here? And you picked Days of Thunder out of the lot. And I was like, absolutely, man. I'm down for some of that. It's December, so the race season's over. It's a little cold, but it'll be cranking up here and again in just a few months. So
that's true.
Let's get into the movie here a little bit and do a quick plot summary, and then we'll talk about it as it unfolds.
Let's do it.
Tom Cruise plays Cole Trickle, and he's not your typical NASCAR driver. He's from California. He's kind of reckless. He doesn't really understand the sport, but he's got talent behind the wheel. So much talent that new race team owner Tim Dahlin brings a recently retired crew chief and legend Harry Hogg, played by Robert Duvall, to be the brains behind his new race team. Slowly and painfully, Cole and Harry learn to trust each other, and they start even doing well, and Cole's rivalry with current NASCAR frontrunner Rowdy Burns lands them in hot water with sports brass. Cole and Rowdy develop a fierce rivalry until both are caught up in a major accident at the Firecracker 400, the second race of the season at Daytona. And Rowdy and Cole are flown to a hospital where they're examined by the effervescent Dr. Claire Lewicki, played by Nicole Kidman, a neurosurgeon whom Cole clearly has a thing for. Rowdy and Cole bury the hatchet while destroying a couple of rental cars on the way to dinner with meeting with NASCAR brass, a great cameo by Fred Dalton Thompson. Meanwhile, a replacement driver, Russ Wheeler, is brought in to run Cole's car while he recuperates in Courts Clare. Finally back in a car, though, Cole has clearly lost his edge and purposely blows his engine, fearing another crash. Dahlin starts a second race team with Wheeler, which adds another bit of Cole's anxiety on the track. Cole's frustration boils over at North Wilkesboro, and he crashes into the celebrating Wheeler during a victory lap. Suspended from racing and fired by Dahlin, Cole goes to check on his friend Rowdy, who is not cleared to race and is in need of surgery, which Rowdy's afraid to undergo. Cole finally convinces Rowdy to have the operation, and Rowdy asks Cole to run his car at the start of next season during the Daytona 500, so his nervous sponsors will continue their financial support of him regardless of the outcome of his surgery. Cole agrees and finds his mojo again, racing hard, chasing Wheeler around the track. Cole makes a daring move and passes Wheeler on the last lap to win the race, and he and Harry share a laugh and celebrate as credits roll. And that's the tight plot summary of Days of Thunder. I think we should just get into the way this thing starts. It throws us right in to the big race. And if you know anything about NASCAR, the cool thing about NASCAR is the biggest race of the year is the first race of the year.
Not the Daytona last race, 500. Not the championship race. It is the opening first race. 50 plus years.
And it does set the tone.
It does.
It does set the tone for the season of the racers. Daytona 500, if you run good at it, you don't necessarily have to win to be a great race car driver, by the way. You just got to run good. Like top fives, top tens are what matters. It's placing. If you run good at Daytona, you feel like you've got a team, you've got a setup that can run good on other big super speedways. And that's where you make your money and make your points in NASCAR. You can win all the road tracks in the world, but if you can't run to the super speedway, you're not going to win the cup. And we get all the Daytona, and I gotta say, Ward Russell is the director of photography on this. He had worked with Tony Scott before. It's his first movie as DP, though, and the way he is able to shoot this is so similar to Top Gun without being Top Gun that it's uncanny. I think that's why some of the comparisons are there, is because you get the low angles down on the track, you get the big above of the tracks, you see the cars coming around. And a couple of years ago, my wife bought me one of those like 5 laps around the Charlotte Motor Speedway thing for my birthday. Yeah. And when the guy came around turn 3, I felt like I was in a scene from Days of Thunder, only to find out, and I didn't know this beforehand, all the in-car shots are shot on the Charlotte Motor Speedway here. Yes. And so when you see the guys doing it, I was like, that's why that looked familiar, because that's what it looks like at 165 miles an hour. And the cinematography of this and laying out and setting up a scene of what a NASCAR race looks like, there's nothing like it. And you've been to them, I've been to them. I can't explain it to anybody who just watches this on television. That's one thing, but to go and experience that is it's a totally unlike any other sporting event.
Totally different thing. Whether you're in the stands or in the car, I've done the ride along and I've done the drive along. I did the drive along. I did the driving experience at Talladega, and that was probably one of the most incredible experiences of my life. But it really does. Like watching this movie, you know, I remember as I was going into turn 3 and looking at just how monstrous that track looks, the movie really does capture it. And like I said at the beginning, that cinematography at the beginning, the music that plays, I remember when I sat down and watched this weekend, I was like, oh, wow, God, just all these happy memories just suddenly got kindled back up. The step by step from the early morning hours at Daytona, the preparation of the track, the cars in the garage, the getting the track dry, people starting to show up in the stands, even the Confederate flags waving in the infield. I mean, that was
it was part of the culture.
That was part of the culture, yeah.
It's just part of it.
It really took me back.
The other thing you brought up there was the music.
Oh.
This is Hans Zimmer's first big deal.
Very one.
And it's the first time with Tony Scott.
Yes.
And you got Hans Zimmer and Billy Idol wrote this theme that David Coverdale sings over in the closing credits if you listen to.
Yeah.
But it's Hans Zimmer, and then they got Jeff Beck, who's a guitar monster. And another big movie of the 90s. He's all over the Young Guns 2 soundtrack for John Bon Jovi. But he's laying down these licks all over this thing. And there's just this. It's a movie made in 1990 or released in 1990. It was all shot in the 80s, and you can feel like the 80s of it because of that music. But it's the Zimmer score is just pounding in this, and it carries the movie, and it sets a tone. You're right. It's this sort of dawn and awakening of the morning. And you see this track, and what's amazing is we don't meet our main character until 15 minutes into this movie.
Yeah.
And that is not something you would do nowadays, particularly for a star like Cruise. He's in the first scene right now.
Yeah.
Nope. He doesn't come up until later. We meet everybody else. We see real race car drivers. We see John Simpson acting like a race car driver. And then we see Michael Rooker as Rowdy Burns, who's basically playing Dale Earnhardt. Let's just say.
He's absolutely
that's who this is supposed to be.
Well, there was a rumor that Tom Cruise had a conversation during shooting, with Dale Earnhardt. And it was rumored that conversation was, would you like to be the antagonist of the film? And he's like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want people to...
I think it's funny that Dale Earnhardt didn't want to be the bad guy, the intimidator. Come on. But the characterization is very much the way he drove. And if you know anything about the guy, it's how he kind of ran.
Is it a coincidence? I mean, Rowdy Burns, the solid black car, with just the white writing on it, which that was my favorite car. That was my favorite car in the movie. That and the City Chevrolet car.
The City Chevrolet is a cool car. We'll talk about that car in a bit. But we meet Rowdy Burns, we meet the whole crew, and we get all of it. And in the middle of it, we cut away. And I think the smartest thing they did in this, to give it that just twinge of realism, is you got Jerry Punch and you got the rest of the ESPN crew to do the voiceover work. So it feels like a real show. It's like when Jerry Maguire got at the time, the Monday Night Football booth, Al Michaels and Dan Dierdorf and those guys to actually call the fake game.
Yes.
They were doing it. Just adds a level of authenticity to it that you couldn't get otherwise.
Yes. No, I absolutely agree. Like I said, this movie, I mean, yes, like I said, there were parts of it that you point out, I was like, actually, they got some things wrong. And when you were talking about cinematography, there were many times where they would say they were at one track, and then you could clearly tell for that 1 second another shot that's, I'm sorry, but Charlotte doesn't have desert mountains in the background. That's clearly Phoenix. There's another one where towards the in the final race where he says, Wheeler knocks me into Gant, Gant spun out. At one point, you see, and this was, I think, the most egregious one, because there's several shots where you have Russ Wheeler, you have Cole Trickle, and then you have the 33 skull of Harry Gant, but then you see it as the 26 Quaker State. Then it's Gant again, and then when the car spins out, it's the 26 Quaker State of Brett Bodine. And then he says, oh, you spun me into Gant. I was like, what did he do?
Yeah, this is when you get Tony Scott's rules of like nobody knows, man. Just go with it. But you know what?
I think that's one of the.
You know what though? In 1990, though, he probably was right. Like only a handful of people would have known the difference, and stuff like that. And the point is it goes by in a second. But what I love is that when they get all this big setup and you get this huge, rock and roll Daytona 500 atmosphere, and we cut away to go up here into North Mooresville or whatever, North Carolina. Oh, yeah. To go catch up with our two, I guess you'd call them like our best supporting characters here. You've got Robert Duvall, who's just a national treasure as an actor.
Oh, yeah.
Chewing up the scenery like that, tractor he's on is chewing up the ground. And Randy Quaid, before he completely went off the deep end as a human being, coming out and playing a great Rick Hendrick. Clone.
Oh my goodness!
To pitch this guy like it's this whole like I've got to have the mentor lead the rogue through the tunnel or whatever thing, and I loved their conversation. And Duvall, of all the actors that do one, has one of the most authentic, true Southern, born into you accents you can get.
Yes, he was perfect.
Yes, and everything he lays out as Harry Hogg is supposed to be like half of Harry Hyde, the legendary race car crew chief, and like 4 or 5 other people. Because Duvall said, I just spent some time talking to these guys, literally around a table, drinking moonshine with them, and I realized very quickly I needed to go read up on all the lingo. And he got it down, because I love his whole bit though here, because you got the big slick city car owner, which I think it's funny to hear Rick Hendrick described as the downtown used car salesman, and I'm like, Rick Hendrick is like an auto empire person here now, but this is 30 years later, and is a racing legend. But to hear him, to see this person who's supposed to be in the early stages of his career, who's trying to start up a race team. And I mean, back in 1990, I remember talking to my brother about this, like, what would it cost to run a race team? And in those days, just to run a car at Daytona, it would cost you about $1.5 million bucks. Now it's a lot more.
Yeah, in those days it would have been. Yeah,
in 30 years ago. So imagine what that is now, right? So just to get a car on the track, you got to have the kind of money that is just insane, right? That you're willing to put into this. And I love he's having to have this conversation with him. And that gets us into our first scene where we finally get Cruise in. We're going to do the test at the track, right? And, here comes Michael Rooker. And I just love this guy, man. Every time he shows up in a movie, I never go see things because he's in them. But every time he shows up in a movie, I just love his performance.
Oh, yeah.
He always looks like he's just annoyed. And that whatever you say is going to be the wrong thing. He's like that economics teacher you had in high school.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I love that scene where you finally meet Tom Cruise. Here he comes rolling in. It's some of the lines in this movie. They stick with you over time. And one of them at that opening scene, he's like, "Where's he from? Glendale, or no, he's like from somewhere." It's like, "Oh, is that up near Glendale? Oh, is that up near Wilkesboro? No, Glendale, California." He's like, "Oh, so he's a Yankee?" Well, no, not really. If you're from California, you're not really a Yankee. You're not really anything. And it's just that kind of sticks. Like, well, I guess that's kind of true.
Well, and what sticks about it is Duvall's response. You said it.
You said it. That's right.
He's already skeptical. Right. It's like, I don't even know who you're talking about. Who is this guy? I don't know. The only person you get after the season starts is somebody that ain't no good or wasn't ever good to begin with, And he's not wrong in that assumption, but we don't know this guy. And then you get the great moment with Tom Cruise coming up. And what I love here is how from the get-go, Tom Cruise usually walks into the scene and he is the hero, right?
Yeah.
And when people ding this movie for being Top Gun in NASCAR, I point and I say, it's a totally different characterization. Like Pete Mitchell, Maverick, would have walked in and been like, get out of my car, and like drove the thing.
Yeah.
This dude walks up and he's like, all right, here's what I do. I know this thing. And he lays out what is a fair assessment of the difference between open wheel racing, sprints, Indy cars, things like that, and NASCAR racing, is that the cars in NASCAR are essentially designed to all be the same.
Yes.
Now, there are tweaks that people make to them because good engineers do that, but it's generally the drivers and the crew chiefs that come up with ingenious ways of using their resources that help you win.
Yeah.
Not a Ferrari engine is better than the Ford engine or the Honda engine or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And I love that they lay that out immediately, because that is for the majority of the audience that does not follow racing. Because as big as NASCAR was in 1990, Nate, you and I are from the South, it was big for us. But if you grew up in Kansas or you grew up in Arizona, you didn't watch that.
No.
That wasn't your thing. You grew up in New York, you didn't watch that. You watched the Indy 500 once a year. You didn't watch NASCAR. That was redneck racing, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I love that they explain that for the audience and that there's all this trepidation. And then you also get like it's pure 80s thing, even though this movie's made in 1990, is when you have the hero turn around and tell the skeptical old person, like, just put me in the moment and I'll prove it to you. And Cruise just lays that cheese out that's well.
Such cheese. Yeah, it's such cheese. But, you were talking about, like, it's the people who say, well, it's Top Gun and NASCAR. And yeah, it really isn't. But then you see Tom Cruise riding up on a motorcycle, just like he did in Top Gun. And then as we see later on, when with the 80s style music playing in the background as they're driving in North Carolina, again, on the motorcycle with the girl in tow. And it's just like, wow, this kind of is like Top Gun, actually, in some ways.
It kind of, it is. It's a lot of the same stuff, but there's a point when it all becomes something more. Yeah. We'll talk about when we get there. But I love that his first interaction, he gets on the track and he's just flying around, right? And they're trying to tell him take it easy, and he's like, no. So he comes in,
drop the hammer, and then he's like, no, you're not.
Yeah, and he comes in and he beats the last guy's time and all this stuff, and it's like, yeah, on one lap,
Yeah.
But, that's how you prove it.
Well,
so we're going to give this guy a shot based on this one lap. And then we do get what I is my favorite car. It's the thing I remember most. That green and gold paint scheme, that City Chevrolet.
Yeah, love it.
Is freaking cool. I can't prove it, but I swear the Gordon DuPont cars for years copied that.
Could have been
a long time.
Well, a little bit about the City Chevrolet car. City Chevrolet is an actual car dealership in Charlotte, North Carolina. When my 92 Volvo finally died in 2008, I was dating a girl in Charlotte at the time. And first place we said we should go to a lot of places and look for cars. The first place I want to go is City Chevrolet. And sure enough, I went there and they had the City Chevrolet Lumina, like one of the Luminas there on display. They had like a whole exhibit display, like a museum display about the movie Days of Thunder at City Chevrolet. It warmed me. I was so happy. I didn't get a car there, but it was very, very cool to see all that. Now, you said that when they were building the car. Now, I will say this is one moment that I did have an issue with. When they're building the car and he's talking about all the things he wants to do, shave an extra inch off, put something an extra little bit of gallon in the tank. It's like, wow, that is crazy illegal. They could not do that. And
the NASCAR rule book, we should say, is incredibly deep.
Yes, it's extremely everything, like you said before, every car has to be the same. And here he is, I'm going to shave an extra inch off and get extra gallon of fuel in here. And here's the other thing I had a problem with was, this is NASCAR. This isn't a local speedway where you just have one car. If you're running a race team, you don't have, even in the 80s, you don't have one car. You have several cars. So I was really like, so it was basically touted as it's the one car. And then the sequence of racing events as he's finally getting onto the track with the other drivers. And they just kind of allude to like, this is the only car. So that sequence of events did bother me a little bit.
I chalk that up to Tony Scott's ability to simplify things for the audience that won't have any point of reference for it. So, similar that he does in a lot of his other movies too, is that I'm going to give you enough information so that you realize this is what this looks like, but I'm not going to tell you how it all works because you don't need to know. And if I did, that would be boring. Like, that's Tony Scott's way of thinking about it. Like, if he showed you how everything on the F-14 worked in Top Gun, that would be a documentary for the military channel.
But Tony Scott also has a tendency, like, to oversimplify things. Like, he does. Some of the dialogue is like the obvious foreshadowing. Like, okay, that didn't need it. Then suddenly when something happens, it's not as dramatic because you know what's coming because from the dialogue, that's the obvious foreshadowing that's going on in advance.
Oh yeah, yeah. And what we're setting up is that Harry Hogg is this genius who knows how to make the most out of the NASCAR or the stock car, the race car.
Right.
And if he can get his driver to trust him, he can build something that will beat everything else out there. When they've already set up the dialogue, though, that the point of NASCAR is everything's built the same, but whatever, details. Tony Scott's like motto in life was like, details.
Well, here's the thing. Exactly. Well, here's the thing I will say about this, like those instances where he kind of dumps it down a little bit, I guess, a little too much in my opinion, are usually followed by something that's pretty freaking incredible. So as I said, the building of the car, I was like, okay, they should just tear that car down right now. That would never pass inspection. But then it goes into the racing sequences. And that's really cool as he's struggling. He doesn't know how to pit properly. He's wrecking all the time. One of the greatest lines during that first race, and Duvall leans into the car in the pits. And he's like, okay, now when you get back out there, I want you to hit the pace car. Like, hit the pace car? Why? You're hitting every other car on the track. I want you to be perfect.
Yeah, a real conversation that apparently happened with Tim Reynolds and several other guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Tim Richmond.
Yeah.
So who Cold Trickle is based on in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
exactly. And I remember Tim Richmond. So that's funny, though, because that's exactly, though, when he says that, again, at that point, being 14 years old, I could believe people in NASCAR would say that
absolutely.
because that's how those guys talk.
Absolutely, yes.
And the whole idea, and this is what always just made me laugh and still does to this day. Everybody gets so ticked off about the fact that he's getting bumped or whatever, and he's like, this guy keeps hitting me. He's like, no, he didn't hit you, he didn't scrape you, he didn't run into you, he rubbed you. Rubbing's racing, and that's not racing. Bull.
That is total bull. Rubbing is racing. Darrell Waltrip, how many times has he said that on NASCAR broadcast? Rubbing's racing, boys. Yes. Yeah, that is absolutely
all said it.
True.
That introduced that phrase, though. to the lexicon. And to their credit, NASCAR, mainly because Waltrip started doing it, embraced that on television and started saying it, and it became part of the culture. And now we all know it. If you know nothing else from Days of Thunder, you know Rubbin's Racing.
Yeah.
And I do like that. I mean, and if you watch a race, at the end of the race, man, like those tire scuff marks and stuff on the side of the paint and everything, like they've improved a lot of that, so it doesn't do it as much because the quarter panel sticks out a lot more now. But if you watch racing in the 90s, race cars looked like hell.
They absolutely did. They bumped and banged. I mean, look at the first Daytona race that was broadcast on national TV. You know, you had Cale Yarborough and Bobby Allison bumping and banging at each other, and they took each other out. That's just how it's done.
Yeah, exactly. That footage, though, and all of that stuff drives the story along so well, because you see Cole start to slowly but surely get a little bit of it, but he's also screwing up a lot, and he doesn't know what he's doing, like you say. And that's when we come to the big moment is, you know, the guys are all just sort of like, whatever, he's going to wreck eventually. They're eating ice cream in the pit. He gets pissed, comes in there. They start a fight while the owner is trying to, you know, coax the sponsors. And I love that this is one of those, like, it's not up on the Glenn Ross, you know, sales meeting, but it's next to it. When Randy Quaid brings the race team in and talks about the monkey effing the football. That
was so unexpected. I was like,
he's exactly right. You guys screwed up big time. And I love how he has the heart-to-heart with Robert Duvall, Harry Hogg, and he says, look, I know you're awesome. You know you're amazing. But if the dude in the car doesn't listen to you and you can't work with him, we're never going to get anywhere. Yeah. You got to get him to trust you and listen to you. And then they have a great conversation, which is supposedly based on several real race conversations that drivers have had with, you know, their crew chiefs. Tom Cruise says to, you know, Cole says, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you mean. You want me to tell you this? I don't understand that.
No, turn here, wedge there. It has no clue.
He didn't know. And what he's talking about is all the engineering stuff on the car. And the truth is, drivers nowadays kind of come up and know that. They learn that stuff. Right. But it wasn't uncommon for those guys to not know that back in those days. Especially a guy like Tim Richmond would not have known that stuff. No. Right? But you can learn it because you learn how to talk about what the car's doing. It tells your guy to translate it, whatever. So they work all that out. And I like that moment, though, because you can see that that's an actual growth moment. Yeah. And that's one of the things I like about this movie is that, unlike Top Gun, when we meet Maverick, he's already great at what he does. Right. He's an amazing pilot already, because you have to be before they even let you on the aircraft carrier. Right. When we're meeting Cole, we watch him figure it out. And that's a lot more of an interesting journey for a protagonist in my mind, watching them learn it. Yeah. Because that's how the audience learns it too.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
This is how I'm going to win.
Much more interesting. And then whenever they're working together, they're working at the racetrack and Robert Duvall's teaching him. It's pretty cool. And I think the moment that you know that bond is developed is when he says, okay, you run 50 laps any way you like. Then you have to run 50 laps my way. And I guarantee you I'll be faster and the tires will be better. And sure enough, at the end, he's, when Randy Quaid's character pulls up and he shows him the two tires. That's his way and this burnt tire. My way, this tire that had no marks on it. He says, I was 6 seconds faster.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's that trust that builds right there.
Yeah, exactly. Because you've had the expert prove to the talent that I know what I'm talking about, and I'm going to let you run your way, but you got to listen to me on certain things. And what it was is that, and not uncommon, I think it's boiled down to a very simple sentence, but it's actually a great piece of science in the movie, is in Indy cars, the car weighs half as much and the tires are twice as wide. Now the car weighs twice as much, the tires are half as wide. You're spinning them out of control and it's burning them up.
And what's interestingly enough is there was this phase, like after Tony Stewart got into NASCAR, there was this huge push of all these race teams wanting to sign these open wheel guys, these IndyCar drivers. So you saw Sam Hornish Jr., you saw Danica Patrick, you saw
Dario
Franchitti, a bunch of them, and they all stunk. They did the same. They were constantly spinning out. And a lot of it was their tire. I mean, it was always tires issues. They were always losing control of the car because, like Robert Duvall says, the car weighs twice as much and the tires are half as wide. And you're
burning them up, and that's the problem, is you slip around the slide and it's all over. So they get the chemistry down. Yes. They start running better, and they finally run well enough. He slings around Rowdy because he has to tell him something, and this sets up a big piece here that Cole doesn't entirely trust himself.
Right.
You know, and it's going to get laid out by Nicole Kidman's character a little bit later in the movie after a big scene, but he doesn't entirely trust himself. Like, he knows he's good, but he doesn't know why he's good. Mm-hmm. And so Harry has to lay this bull on him about, I've got to put special tires in there just so you can pass at the outside or whatever. It's a bunch of nonsense. Yeah. But again, in NASCAR culture, crew chiefs will tell drivers anything to get them to shut up.
Yes, they will. Yes, they will.
Like, the force is with you, whatever. And so he gets around Rowdy, wins the race. They get the sponsor. And this is the thing too that I always loved is like the NASCAR sponsors, before they realized that like the color needs to look a certain way on television, would put the gaudiest, dumbest looking color schemes, like a pink and black car.
I was like, wow, when they got the Superflow car out, I was like, wow, that is a hot pink right there. That's I mean, it was not the first pink NASCAR out there, but it was still wow, for the movie. You had this awesome paint scheme. Right. No, it didn't. You had this awesome City Chevrolet green and yellow paint scheme. And then you go to this, and it's like, oh, okay. So we're going to this way.
But it is the kind of thing you would do as a first race team, right? Yeah, you take what you got, you sponsor. Oh, yes, we are riding this baby.
Mane and Tail Horse and People shampoo was a sponsor, and it was pink. And they were happy to slap that logo on the car.
Exactly. Well, you know, and then you've got the array of, you know, little stickers all over the car, you know, which are the, you know, a lot of companies realized years ago that like we can have one car or we can be on everybody's car. Yeah. And so they figured out that was the smarter way to go. Yeah. And so, you know, it worked. But they get out now, they've got the Superflow car. We're winning races. Everything's right. And we have a little fun here. You know, we get some NASCAR stories. We get a little bit of Cole's backstory that the reason he had gotten fired from his last team was his dad was basically the owner of the race team, but he was also like a junk bond salesman. So he was a con man. Yeah. So he's someone who doesn't trust people because of this. That's part of why he is the way he is. We get a little bit of John C. Reilly's dad's character, who it sort of overshadows the whole movie, that Harry's last driver died in a bad car wreck. And supposedly he, you know, there was
he's hearing
could have been on high on fumes. And that's why Harry got out, because he didn't want to deal with it. But I don't know whatever the truth is, and the thing is, they never tell us what the actual story was.
Right,
you can kind of guess what you want it to be. Yeah. But it's one of those legends of racing that you always wonder, like, oh, why did this happen? Why did that happen? You know, it happens with these guys, and you get a little bit of that. They get the stripper playing the state trooper to mess around with Tom Cruise, which is a funny scene. Yeah, it sets up a scene when he totally accosts Nicole Kidman later in the movie. But we've set up for the next race, the summer race at Daytona. Mm-hmm. And that's the cool thing about NASCAR, is that you make all the big tracks twice in the season for people that don't know NASCAR. Yeah. So you do Daytona in February to kick off the season, and then you come back in the summer when it's hot as blazes in Florida, and you do another race week down in Daytona. And the Firecracker 400, I don't think it's even called that anymore, but back then that was a big, it was like a midpoint race. It was a way to kind of check where you were, how you were doing in the standings. So Cole's in this great race. He's running hard against Rowdy. It's just they're flying up and down the track. And the big one happens. And, growing up around Talladega culture, I knew the big one was just part of what we talked about. The huge wreck. I've been to every time I've been to Talladega, I've seen one. I've seen people walk away from stuff. I have no idea how they did it. It's, modern engineering is fantastic. But the big wreck happens, and Cole and Rowdy are part of this huge, huge wreck. And they have to fly to the hospital now because they've had head injuries. And this was a big deal for me to watch, because as a kid, I sustained a head injury, not in a car wreck, but similar. So I kind of could relate with some of this stuff and some of what they were talking about. And so it was, I don't know, that's another reason I've kind of attached to this movie through the years, is because I experienced some of this stuff. So I've seen it. The only thing, and I'll ding this movie for this, is I feel like they kind of get us out of the crash so fast.
Way too fast.
Quick to the hospital. Yeah, nowadays, I think you would linger on that a little bit and show what it's actually like, because the safety crews around NASCAR are incredible. Yeah. And they're very cautious. They're very careful about what they do. It almost cuts too quick.
And it also cuts too quick, and it also doesn't explain what happened to Rowdy as he's just going through that. He has a smile on his face as he's driving through, but then his car just slides sideways. Like it just... How did that come about? Was he hit? That was never really explained, like how that happened. Because even when Cole wakes up in the hospital and Harry tells him, "Hey, we're not sure exactly what happened. We think another guy hit you." that was never really fully explained. That would have been nice to see in full detail. Like, how did Rowdy get loose? How did Cole run into him at full speed? I saw a wreck like that at an ARCA race one time, and unfortunately the guy who hit the other guy that exact same way, T-boned him the exact same way at full speed, the guy who hit him actually died, and the other guy was paralyzed for a while. So that was a very serious accident. And then, as you say, we see him go to the hospital, and then the movie takes a completely different turn from there.
Yeah, we get the love story in the movie, and it is introduced because Nicole Kidman plays Claire Lewicki. She's one of the neurosurgeons. She's not the head of the department, right, at least, so she's not doing a Christmas Jones, James Bond thing or whatever. But she's a surgeon. She's young, but she's qualified. And what I liked about Nicole Kidman here is she talks very specific, and she's the kind of actress that knows things. There's a funny story she likes to tell that she told the producers, like, hey, I want to spend a couple of days, shadowing some neurosurgeons. Right, yeah. And they said, it'll be a huge waste of your time. like, we're not going to ask you to do that. But she did it anyway.
Yeah, she did. She wanted to study.
And she had it down. And we see that, like, Cole, he's got a concussion, essentially. And so it's kind of made his vision real blurry. He can't see anything. He's kind of freaking out, too. And then Rowdy is like, get me out of this right now. I don't do hospitals. I'm not going to do it. Very Dale Earnhardt, by the way. I don't do this stuff. Get me out of here. He's tough and rumble, wants to get free. And they both have sustained some pretty serious injuries. And when you finally see Cole calm down, he's in the MRI, and I've had CAT scans and MRIs, for years. And so I again can relate to a lot of that. And there's something he says in it, though, that I thought was such a great humanizing line for this character that in another movie they would have never done, but they bothered to leave in here, is where he says, can somebody please talk to me? When I'm in the car, there's this guy that talks to me.
I did like that moment. I really like that moment.
Yeah. And having been in those, machines again, it is an incredibly lonely experience.
Oh, yeah.
It really is. It's awful. And so it's neat to, that they have that little moment for him. And then, of course, beautiful Nicole Kidman walks in the room to examine him, and still out of his mind a little bit, Cole thinks, oh, this is another setup. And before the guys can stop him, of course, he's, like, oh, don't you want to feel the real machine or whatever?
Yeah.
And she's like, not exactly. So, but what's neat is that you can tell he feels terrible about this after he finds out, like, oh, no. Then we get, again, what I think is the cameo of the movie. Out of all the NASCAR cameos in here, the fact that they got Fred Thompson to come in and crush up some Winston Select light packs.
Oh.
And be the head of NASCAR.
Oh, yeah.
To just go off on, and this is apparently word for word conversation.
I wish
that Dale and Jeff Bodine
had exactly. I wish that the Francis would have been more like Fred Thompson. I think NASCAR would have probably succeeded a little bit more had Fred Thompson been ahead of it. And that slow reveal when he turns around, you're like, hey, that's Fred Thompson. Oh,
yeah, and just a great character actor, and gone from the earth now. But what a fantastic dude, and did work for decades. But and shows up in these kind of movies and does this role. And I love this whole bit about, like, this is what I'm going to do to you. I'm going to give you the Japanese inspection. I'm going to tear you apart if you do. You even look at each other sideways on a racetrack again. And these guys are like, okay, we're getting chewed out, Dad. And then it's like, we're going to go to dinner together. And then we get, like, the great comic relief scene.
Oh, yeah.
Of Michael Rooker and Tom Cruise arguing about who's going to drive to dinner. And we're like, no, let's just go to the local budget rent-a-car, sign up for the $15 insurance, and wreck the absolute hell out of these two cars.
And that was really cool. That was also very cool. Now, going back to the scene where we have the Fred Thompson scene when he makes his first cameo, and they're talking Dr. Lewicki about, are they clear to drive? There was a couple of things in that scene that I also had some issues with. Like, one, they were incredible. I mean, not Fred Thompson, but the other guy was incredibly rude, just talking to her really hard. I was like, wow, would they really? I would think the safety of their drivers would come first. Why are they talking to her in this way? And then the other thing is, so they're at the restaurant, and they're waiting on Rowdy and Cole to show up. And Fred Thompson says, if you can't control your drivers any better than this, maybe you should stick to selling used cars in downtown Charlotte. Where's Rowdy's owner?
That's what I wanted to know too. That line comes in, and I'm like, did did Tim buy Rowdy's
Yeah,
car?
I was
like, no,
because there was nobody with Rowdy in the meeting with Dr. Lewicki, and there was nobody else.
I think there was a guy. There was one guy over to the side that I couldn't tell what he was doing.
Well, that was the same guy that was in the meeting that was working for Fred Thompson. So
okay, so that wasn't his guy. Then. Okay,
yeah. So
you know what? I don't know. That is a weird moment because you would think if he. Well, okay, just to spread that out, if he already had Rowdy Burns, he wouldn't need another race team. Then there would also be no big deal about having the second one later. So that is a weird line. It almost feels like and this movie too, to be fair to it, they were writing scenes days it was happening, like the day of. Yeah. They were feeding lines to the action. So who knows what rewrite happened?
That's true.
Yeah, and so it could have been in there somewhere, but I'm with you. I was like, where's Rowdy's people here? I don't see them. But the point is that they show up together, and you can tell that the rivals have now become friends.
Yes.
So it's another point I give this movie when people say, it's Top Gun and NASCAR. We never see Iceman and Maverick get along until they save each other's ass and are back on the aircraft character at the end. And then it's kind of understood that you would hug it out because you both just didn't die.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a different moment than this. And I understand that if we ever get the Top Gun Maverick sequel, that'll be much more fleshed out. You'll know that story better. But that was something, though, that Tom Cruise apparently insisted on, was that I'm going to have this rival, and then we've got to at some point bury the hatchet, because he had heard so many NASCAR stories about these guys who were rivals who eventually buried the hatchet years down the line. And it's fun to see that, and to hear those guys talk about it. And they have the little dinner thing or whatever, and they're like, oh, we had a little car trouble. And you see the cars in the valet lot, and they're just destroyed.
Absolutely.
But again, these guys don't care. And apparently that was a real story too.
Yeah.
And so we get past that, but at that point, Cole's not clear to return. Rowdy's clearly not clear to return. And all Cole is focused on is, I got to get this doctor's attention, right? So Harry does go and kind of, apologizes on his behalf and all this stuff. And she seems to get it. Then Cole kisses her in the parking lot. They have this whole moment. But I like that the love story between him and Claire is allowed to develop over a series of moments and conversations.
Yes, it's not just automatic, like love at first sight kind of thing.
Neurosurgeon department to let her fly to Charlotte to check him and Rowdy out before the next race or whatever, which is, kind of neat.
Yeah.
And they get to drive together, like you said. We have the Top Gun, the top off the car where they're driving together and all this stuff, and they're spending time together, and they're together. And she does the examination. He comes on to her. And what I love about this, though, is especially in 1990, this was a progressive thing to do. When he's like, "I can't believe you were ignoring me," and then Nicole Kidman just absolutely plants him. He's like, "I wasn't. I was just doing my job, moron." And then she just goes to town on him. And I was like, "You go, girl. Have agency. Be you."
That right there probably shows you why. Like, speaking of Tom Cruise's picks, I mean, he handpicked Nicole Kidman after he saw the movie Dead Calm. He says, "Hey, I want her in this film," and that's just the film they fell in love with. This is that they fell in love in together, and from then on they had the relationship and then the marriage. But it was working on this film is when their actual off-screen love story started.
Yeah, it's so fun, too, because in this year in Film Strip, Kurt and I have just reviewed Eyes Wide Shut a month or so ago, so we saw the end of it, literally.
Yeah.
So their careers together and their relationship together in a movie. But it's neat to see that here. It's neat to see a character, though, that because, again, it's a Hollywood trope to cast a beautiful woman in a, heavy role like a neurosurgeon or nuclear physicist or whatever, and they're just there to be eye candy. And for her to actually have brains and show them throughout the movie.
Which is very different from a Bruckheimer produced film. You'll see the women who say they're one thing, but they're like Christmas Jones in the James Bond film. Yes. They're like, "Oh, you're literally a rocket scientist, and wow, there's no way, it's not believable." But in this case, it was. In this case, it absolutely was. Like, I could genuinely see her being a doctor, and she had her own life, her own personality. She was not just eye candy. So, I mean,
and she also wasn't completely taken by this guy.
No, exactly.
She kind of went along with it. She hooked up with him, but she was like, "Are you ever going to do anything else besides race? Because that's really not safe, and I gotta have things going for me. So where's this going?
Yeah,
or do I need to leave? Like, you can tell it gets a little fun there between them. But I like that, though, and I like that when they go to visit Rowdy, he clearly is not right. He's got problems, and she tries to examine him, and of course he falls out. Cole gets sick. Rowdy gives him hell for it. But you can tell, though, some of the things that Harry has said about race car drivers and sort of their fears of being in hospitals and being around other guys who've been hurt and stuff. That's a very real thing.
Oh, it's a very real thing. Yeah.
Yeah, because he's right. They don't want to be reminded of what can happen to them because it'll make them lose their edge. And that's what we see happens to Cole. Now, we glossed over. We should talk about Cary Elway's one scene where he comes in here and he gets blown off by Tom Cruise. I didn't know who this dude was in 1990. Princess Bride, all that stuff was years later for me. And him, I think it's maybe one of the first things he ever did, and now I would call him the Saw guy. Sorry. But he's the doctor in the first and last Saw movie so far. But spoiler alert. But yeah, I loved how you meet this guy and you realize I hate you, and I don't even have a reason to.
Oh yeah, just in that first meeting, I hate him, and I'm not sure why I hate him. And then the minute before anything happens, so after they've been down to visit Rowdy, suddenly they're watching TV, and they says, well, no, now they has another race team meet the driver of the 18 Hardee's car, which is a very cool paint scheme, by the way, and was actually on the track for quite some time. It actually in real NASCAR races. And then introducing Russ Wheeler. And then you didn't like him. You automatically didn't like him. And again, you didn't know why, but you just didn't like, it's that punchable face syndrome, I guess. Maybe that's what it was. But he goes to show, as we see later, he is exactly who you think he is.
No, it's exactly though, right? He's cocky. He's just like Cole, but Cole's our guy. We can't have second cocky guy.
No.
Because we have veteran cocky guy and Rowdy who we like now. And who you kind of always like because you can't deny how good he is. And if you know anything about NASCAR, that's Dale. So you're like, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And then you got Cole who you've grown to like, or behind for the movie because he is the protagonist. And then you meet this guy and you're like, no, you're the bad cocky guy. You're the Iceman that we hate.
Yes.
You might as well have been Russian.
Exactly.
1990. He was such a, but again, I'll give Cary Elwes, he's not a grand actor. Okay, let's not give him too much, but he was perfect for this because he just had a little bit to do and he played it right. And I love how the split, loyalties are immediately called by Harry. He's like, who are you going to be rooting for? You can't have two race teams, which that's funny because race teams now have 3 and 4 and 5 drivers and stuff like that.
Right.
But back in 1990, that would have been for an upstart guy, for a new owner to all of a sudden throw 2 teams out in the same season. That would have seemed like a bad idea.
That would have been a really bad idea. Bad chemistry. Yeah. Nothing good could have come from a startup team. Exactly like you were saying, a startup team. Now, if this was an established team, then yeah, sure. Come on, everybody was doing it.
If they had run next year and you bring Wheeler in, you kind of get it because then there's time to build him in. Yeah. Everybody gets to know him. But he comes in, he runs good, and then now he's got this other team, and then here's Cole. And so Cole gets back on the track, though, and he has clearly lost it. And this is very much the after Goose is dead and we can't fly good anymore from Top Gun, but much more believable because that almost comes off really stupid in Top Gun. In this one, because Navy pilots are ice cold. This is just how they are. Yeah. It's how those dudes roll. NASCAR drivers, though, if they've been in a bad wreck, getting back in a car is sometimes a very scary proposition. Yes. Blowing the engine just so you can get out of it happens all the time. To this day.
Yes, absolutely all the time. That was one of the things I did like that that he did, and then Russ Wheeler did take advantage of that, of Cole's weakness. Now, why he would have picked on Cole, I'm not sure, because if they work together, like in any other race team, you get the same resources, you get the same intel, you help each other, you have a partner on the track you can win with, and at the same time, whenever here's Russ knocking Cole all over the track. And then, as we see, Cole finally snaps. He's had enough. Right at the end of the race, Cole is freaking out. You can see him. He's clearly still shaken from the accident. He can't get it together. And then Russ just bumps and bangs him all day long. And then he finally just spins him out. Takes him out of the race. And Russ goes on to win. And what happens at the end of the race, Cole goes to his pit crew, says, change my tires. He says, I don't know why. The race is over. He's like, change my tires. So they change his tires, and he hauls ass back onto the track while Russ Wheeler's taking his victory lap and plows him into the wall. And at that moment, you hear Randy Quaid's character saying, he's destroyed both my cars. And it's like, well, your guy was destroying that one. Now, you should have told him, hey, knock it off. This is costing me money by doing that.
You're exactly right. That is the biggest like NASCAR-y plot hole that I'll pick on in this is that Wheeler should have used Cole to get around the track better and just continually passed him when Cole should have been like, "Hey man, I'm the lead driver here." Yeah. That should have been that would have been a much more realistic portrayal of that. Is that I'm going to use this guy to drag me around the track and then I'm going to fling around him because drafting's a very cool thing and they do that whole sweet and low thing on Nicole Kidman's leg for it, which was apparently Tony Scott's idea of how to describe drafting. And I got to say, good choice,
yeah,
because the other way would have been much more boring. But anyway, so at least for a 14-year-old boy in 1990. But that would have made more sense is that Wheeler was just constantly, jumping out in front and had kind of overstepped. And that would have made sense because there's no way. The other thing, too, is if he's out there bumping and grinding Cole, Dalen would have got on the phone to him because owners do this and be like, stop wrecking my race car.
Yes, they absolutely do that. They absolutely do that. And I did like at the end after that happened, then you see both race teams start duking it out in the pits, which is incredibly common.
That happens so many times.
So many times. To this day it happens. But I did like Randy Quaid being right in the middle of it. It's like, you're fired. You're fired. You're fired. I love that.
Right.
Yeah.
I know, but that's what happened. So Cole gets fired, Harry's fired, the Superflow race team is done, which I'm sure the Superflow people are like,
we really didn't get our money's worth right here. Yeah.
Really? Can we get the back quarter panel of the Hardy's car now or something? For this? But anyway, put that aside. Put that over. He gets fired. He's out or whatever. And he decides that, okay, I've got to go and convince Rowdy to have the surgery. And he's taking Claire back to the airport. And he gets into a thing with a taxi driver and she jumps out of the car. And this is when I think Nicole Kidman has her best scene. She absolutely lets into him. And I love that they gave her these lines and she just totally nails it. She talks about how you're scared. You're scared you don't have the nerve to do this. You may have never had it. You don't know what you're going to do with yourself. And then her last line to him was great. He's like, I hate you. You make me sound like a doctor.
Yeah.
And she walks away and I was like, ouch.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah.
And I mean, she levels it.
And I love that.
And I love that because nowadays, like Tom Cruise would never let that happen to him in the movie. Like that is no. But back then he wrote that for her apparently. And she just killed it. And it was just amazing. And I love though that they gave her to do that because it does inform everything he does the rest of the movie. Yeah,
and I do. And that right there set the tone for what he does. That was that wake-up call he needed. And the next thing you know, he goes over to Rowdy's house. Rowdy he can't remember his name. He points to him. He points to the trophy. He's like, hey, what'd you win this one for? And he can't remember. He's like, that's the Winston Cup. That's like the pinnacle of your profession. You can't remember what that is. And he's like, all right, we can fix your brain now, or we can fix it at the hospital. We can fix it right here. Now, what's it going to be? And then he does convince him to go down in there. But you still see Cole is still struggling. He at least got Rowdy into the hospital, and then the diagnosis for Rowdy is not good. He's never going to be able to drive a race car again, but Rowdy needs somebody to drive his car next year. He says, the sponsor put their money on me and not the car. I was like, well, isn't that how it usually works? I mean, they don't care about the car. They just need the driver to drive it. Like it could be, Jeff Gordon in his prime could have went to some scrub race team, and I guarantee you he would have brought sponsorship.
Well, yeah, I mean, you put Gordon and Chip Ganassi on a team together, and that you were going to win. Yeah. This is how it was for years, and that's how it's worked for a lot of years for a lot of these guys. But I like what he says though is, and he's exactly right. And I can't help but think if somewhere along the way Cameron Crowe and Tom Cruise had this conversation about this, because this is in Jerry Maguire with the guy talking about how I got to play next year, I got to get my bonus.
Yeah,
the hockey player with the concussions or whatever. And I thought about that because I saw Jerry Maguire not that long ago again, and I thought, wow, I wonder if Cruise influenced that at all. There's nothing, I couldn't find anything on the internet about it, so it's just me putting those together. And it could be total synchronicity, but I just am curious about it. But it's a right conversation is that, look, I got a lot of things that this year would have been the year to pay for them. I need somebody who I trust in this car. I need you to run this car. So that's one part of it. And I love how Cruise walks out of that when Cole leaves that scene. He said, we'll talk about the business part later, because he starts to freak out a little bit. You can tell, I can't think about this right now.
Yeah.
And he walks straight past Claire, doesn't give her a look, nothing. And she's like, he's like, just tell him I'll call him later. and he goes straight to Harry. And they have that great conversation where he's got to convince Harry, you know, to build the car for him, to set it up for him. Because that wouldn't make any difference at all. It's the same car. In fact, Rowdy's crew probably would know that car better, but whatever. We've built in that only Robert Duvall can touch the car and make it magic. And so they have the great argument, though, about, you know, you're going to die if you get back in that race car. It's a good scene between Robert Duvall and Tom Cruise.
Really great scene. I absolutely love that. Just that fighting right there where everything with Cole, everything with Robert Duvall, everything comes out in the open. And it's just like you suddenly see the charming persona that Robert Duvall suddenly had. Then you see this anger come out. That anger about talking about Buddy Bretherton and, Buck Bretherton. Buddy Bretherton. Yeah, that's the one that died in the car. And then when Tom Cruise asked him, like, how was he doing in that race before he died? And then he just snaps. Yeah. So there's definitely more to that story. It's like, wow, what did happen? And that's why there was no investigation, because there was going to be an investigation, and Harry just says, no, I retire. So there couldn't have been an investigation. So that was,
I like that,
really
though.
powerful.
Like, I really like that, because nowadays, like, a movie would bother to explain that. We'd get a flashback, we'd hear all about it, you know. And I like that is just dangled out there and it's left.
I do too.
Because that's life, though.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens all the time. People just don't tell you.
For a movie that had a tendency to like I mentioned before, throw out the obvious foreshadowing, I like that sort of just left it hanging there, because you wonder about it, but at the same time, it's not necessary to know the full story. You just you leave it to your imagination to know.
Well, you know, it's very similar, and I've made so many comparisons. This is just another one. The Top Gun moment where Tom Skerritt is telling Maverick how his dad really died.
Oh,
you know, like, to me, like, that scene kind of matters. But if you watch that movie again, it would be so much better if they played it like this.
Yeah.
And said, there's some things you just don't get to know in life, son.
That's right. I love that.
And you got to move on.
Yeah.
I watched this and I'm like, this is so much better than that. You know, because that seems so cheesy and I don't know, not earned the way that this seems very earned between these two guys. And then they have a laugh about, I don't know about this.
Yeah.
You know? And then, you know, they're going to get on the track together. And then we get another, you know, Robert Duvall talking to the car, which is funny. I mean, I just love it. And the thing starts leaking oil on him.
Oh, that was, even at 14, I remember seeing that. And that when I was working at the Speedway at 14 years old, that happened one Friday. We had the truck. We had the car loaded up onto the trailer and everything like that the night before. We get up the next morning. I ride my bike down to the guy's house, and I get off the bike, and the driver and the crew chief and the driver's dad are standing around just looking at the car. I was like, "What's wrong?" And he's like, "Look under, you know, look on the trailer underneath the engine." And I looked, and I was like, "Is that oil?" And he says, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what does that mean?" He's like, "That means we're not racing this Saturday." I was like, "Oh no!" And they explained it to me. Like, we have to basically replace the whole freaking engine. Like, tell me when you're out of school this week and come on down. We need your help. So, exactly. That's exactly. Yeah. So when I saw that dripping, I was like, oh, wow, that's real bad.
And we should say, like, you know, you would think, like, if you have an oil leak in your car, like, you can go fix the gasket on it and whatever. On a race car, no. The whole thing is gone. You start over, because if you don't, the chances of it catching on fire are incredible.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't need that. So you do it then, and we'll go ahead and say it now because they reveal it later in the race. Harry calls up Tim and says, "I need an engine."
Yeah.
And Tim gives him an engine for his car to do it or whatever. And it gets paid off later because he's only got one gear left and they're having to push him to get him, you know, fast enough to get out of the thing. And Dalen makes the Hardee's crew push too. And the NASCAR officials busting him for it. And he's like, "Nope, that's my engine in that car. I own that."
I did like that.
So I'm like,
that. I did. Like, that's a cool really like that a lot.
And I like that moment because it redeems Dalen for us.
Yeah,
a little
it does.
Bit. Like at that point, like we needed something that would, because he's not a bad guy. He's just a businessman.
That's right.
I mean, that's he's just trying to win.
Yeah.
That's his whole thing.
And the whole, like, just give me the high gear totally works. It's Daytona. You only need the high gear. That's it.
If you get that thing going up fast enough, that's all you gotta have.
Because when he says you need to be at full speed when that green flag drops. So I did love that.
And he passes the whole thing.
And that was but even at the beginning of that race, he's for half the race he is in last place. He's hanging out at the back. He's not communicating anything to Harry. Harry's to sit there, Cole, what's going on? Answer me. What's wrong with the car? What's wrong? Answer me, please. He's like pleading with him. Please talk to me.
And then the big wreck again.
And then the wreck happened. You see him sweating and breathing. He's having the flashbacks. But then, Harry's pleading was like, go high. I promise you. I know it. I know it in my heart that you're going to be fine. And so he trusts him. And sure enough, he blows through it. And then it's just like he's coming out of the smoke. It's just like the clouds lift and he's like, he's back. He's like, okay, I'm out of here. I got this. And
exactly.
The old
Cole running
returns,
great.
yeah.
And we get a great end sequence where, and Wheeler's got him pegged. It's like he always goes outside. He always passes on the outside to come get me. That's his move. That's what he does. And I've seen this happen in races. It's so exciting to see. Is the guy acts like he's going one way and he deeks around the other side of you. And he takes the inside and you get that just, great finish there at the end.
I remember one of the most exciting races was a Daytona race that I saw. It was the summer race in 2008. And my driver, Tony Stewart, he was driving the Burger King car. And on the last lap, he did the exact same thing. All I could think of was Days of Thunder. And he kept going high on Bobby Labonte. Bobby Labonte kept cutting him off. And then right coming off of turn 4, Tony Stewart goes high. Labonte goes high. Stewart goes low, starts to slingshot past him. And Stewart, because he slingshot past him, he already got the front of his car underneath him. And Labonte tried to cut him off, but Stewart's nose was already there. And Labonte went out and Stewart won. And it was just an incredible ending that I still watch recordings of. But yeah, that was that. It was the only thing I didn't like about that was the obvious foreshadowing where Russ's crew chief's like, be careful, Russ. He's going to try to slingshot past you. And he's like, I know, Cole. He'll always go on the outside. And I was like, oh, don't say that. Just don't. That didn't need to be said. You take that line out. That makes that slingshot way better. Even when Cole says, this one's for you, Harry.
That's a perfect line.
Yeah.
Like if you had just had that, if you had the crew chief telling Russ that, and Russ just says, I got him. And that's all he has to say. Because
even that
nowadays, like you hear these guys in the car like all the day now on the television when you watch a race, and that's what they would say. Like, I got him, and that's all he would say. And then if Cole had come back with like, this one's for you, Harry, and then he slings the other way around, that would have been perfect. Because you've got that music pumping. I mean, Zimmer nails that.
Yes, he does. Too. Yes, he does.
It's a great ending. It's a great end of the race. And I love, though, that this movie doesn't just end on the big crescendo like that. It allows it to come back down. We go to the winner circles. Cole Kidman's there. Everybody's there. Even Dalen's kind of happy. Russ kind of tips his hat to him. The whole bit. Everybody's happy. And Harry's just sitting over there kind of exhausted from the whole experience. And I love that the last thing we get is just a little moment between them. And there's like, I'll race you. And then they just start running together. The old man and the kid running
And that
together.
was really cool.
It's fun.
I mean, that was also one of those unbelievable moments, too, where the winner of the Daytona 500 just walks away from victory lane without being bothered, without anybody following him, to just go have a quiet conversation with his crew chief on the side. Yeah, the TV people wouldn't let that happen. The sponsors,
that would have been hours later.
Yes,
that would have been hours later.
Yeah,
that happened because those guys. You are taking pictures with everybody. You're talking about the Percolator 400 today ran real well, and we had the Mellow Yellow 51 really turned up, and really appreciate the Goodyear tires and.
Yes, they would. They got to get all the sponsors out there. They got to get all the sponsors out there.
It's how they're trained to do it, and that's what makes it fun. Talladega Nights actually does a really good job of laying out how that works. So more than this movie did, but this movie doesn't do that. This is where it ends, and it leaves us with that big moment, and then of course we get the big David Coverdale song. Singing over that theme the whole way out as we go to credits. So I guess we're at the part of the podcast where it's time for final thoughts, recommendations, and popcorn ratings. So Nate, what are yours for Days of Thunder?
So my final recommendations is this. It's when I remember the first review I saw of this film was the Nashville Network's review of this film. And if there's ever a NASCAR audience, it's going to be those who turn into the Nashville Network. And they slammed it. They did not like it. They're like, we don't like the name. We don't like the way it's shot. We don't like the fact that he's from California. They were just pointing out all of this stuff that they didn't like. And I remember thinking, I was like, okay, it's not that bad. To me, growing up in the South, watching NASCAR in the 80s, I enjoy it. Even though at 14 I was pointing out all the things that were wrong, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's still, despite its flaws, it sticks with you. I mean, what can you compare it to? To me, it's like with food or drink or movies. Those things that really stick out to me are ones I can't compare to anything else. You can't compare Talladega Nights to it. Talladega Nights is a spoof. It's a comedy. You can't compare Stroke or Ace to it or Cannonball Run or anything like that. You can't even compare it to Top Gun. In some ways you can, but it's not Top Gun. So for that, I greatly appreciate it. It was a part of my childhood. It was probably at that point in my life where I was more into racing than I'd ever been. I would recommend it. I would certainly recommend this for people who like Tom Cruise. You got to watch it. For the pure fact of where he's at in his career at this. You had mentioned this was one of the first films where he had a lot of say in a lot of things, and it works. Yes, you still see those Bruckheimer hints in there. You still see a lot of you certainly recognize Hans Zimmer's music. As we can see in a lot of the Christopher Nolan films. But overall, popcorn size, this is tough. Before I sat down to watch it, I would have given it a medium popcorn. But then when I turned it on and that opening music played, and it just drew me back. Now, this is because I've seen it and I loved it as a kid. I gotta give it a large. I'm not gonna give it an extra large, but I gotta give it a large because it's certainly one you can watch it through a large popcorn, and you're not gonna walk away thinking, "Wow, this is one of the greatest, most influential movies I've ever seen." But you'll walk away feeling, you know what? This is 2 hours of hour and a half of my life that was worth it. Yeah.
All right. I got to say, man, this one, like I said, holds a special place in my memories, too, because of when I saw it, who I saw it with, where I was. And it's one that I have always felt like got undue criticism.
Yeah.
Bruckheimer says this ended an era of Hollywood filmmaking because the Michael Cimino Heaven's Gate ended the auteur director era of filmmaking. He said this ended the studios trusting the powerhouse producers.
Yes.
He said, producers that made movies, he said, Simpson and Bruckheimer were more known than the directors we had on our movies. And this one didn't do what Top Gun did. So they fired us and we ended up going to Disney and Hollywood Studios, and it severed his relationship with Paramount forever, pretty much. And it ended an era of that because it underperformed. I mean, $157 million and, again, $40 million on rentals. It underperformed. I mean, that's just, it's ridiculous because this was also when Hollywood though started to, if your movie didn't like quadruple the budget, if it was a big budget movie, then it was a failure in some way. I always felt like this movie got a lot more criticism than it deserved. And here's the best way I've learned through the years to be able to sum up this movie. Imagine if Top Gun actually had a plot. Then that would be Days of Thunder. And that's what this movie is. Top Gun is a rock and roll movie with some great flying sequences, but there is no plot to that movie. The people in it will tell you there is no plot to that movie. Tony Scott said there was no plot. It didn't matter. This movie had a plot. And it had a plot because Tom Cruise had a lot to say about it and because Bruckheimer and Simpson insisted on it. They fought with Scott every day about this thing, and Ward Russell tells stories about that. But they fought every day about it. But what came out was something that is always watchable. It's not perfect. It's got its moments. It's definitely got some sheen on it that is just of its time.
Yes.
But it is infinitely watchable,
Absolutely.
Especially if you're into this kind of thing. And again, if you grew up like we did and you watch NASCAR at all and racing, this is great. If you want like a real highly technical, great race movie, Ford versus Ferrari is
your
movie. That is a fabulous movie for that. There's movies for that. This is not that movie. No. And it doesn't pretend to be. And that's what I like about it. This is a total large popcorn and a lot of fun. And it is very much the beginning of Tom Cruise hero action star person, that he became. Or it's in that swing of things when he started to do that. They would take a few years and kind of get off of that and do other stuff. But when he started doing Mission Impossible and all those other things, that's when he's kind of leaned into that now.
It's interesting. If you look at the late 80s, early 90s, as far as sports films, it's a damn good time. You think about you've got in this 10-year period between 86 to 96. You've got Major League. You've got Days of Thunder. You've got Bull Durham. You've got Field of Dreams. You've got some films that center around sports, and they do it, in my opinion, very well. I am very impressed. This would be something that I could totally see myself doing in a weekend, is binge watching a series of late 80s, early 90s sports films. And Days of Thunder would absolutely be included in that. And it takes you back to for people like you and I who are in our early to mid 40s, it takes us back to that time where we were really getting into sports as kids. And these movies were kind of shaped that. Whatever, if it was NASCAR or baseball or football, whatever, these movies kind of shaped that. And to just sit down over a weekend and just go back to watching these movies, remembering, wow, this is why I liked this sport. And Days of Thunder certainly did that for me. It, despite its flaws and despite some of some of the script writing that I had issues with and some of the errors I saw on the track, it's still a NASCAR movie, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
It's an absolute blast, and it's a lot of fun to watch and to just have out. And I mean, I think it's so much fun that we've included it here. It's, it's at the end of the NASCAR season, so it was a perfect time to drop this movie in. We got some fun stuff coming up on the horizon as we round out 2020 here today. I was going to kind of give everybody a little teaser of what's coming up. So next week we've got Event Horizon on.
Ooh.
Irina and her friend Chris came on. We did that one. That's going to be a blast. December the 14th, gang, we have something super special coming for you because it's the holiday season. Hopefully you're going to be able to travel, go see family. You're going to be off for a little bit of time. Hopefully it's a good time for you, but you're going to need a distraction because as much as you may miss your family once you're around them for 35 minutes, you're going to realize I don't want to do this anymore. And you're going to need to run on a treadmill or something. So we are releasing not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, 6 episodes on one day. The entire Paranormal Activity series will drop in your subscribe box on December the 14th. You'll get the 4 first Paranormal Activity movies, the marked ones, and then the Ghost Dimension. Now, we recorded those over a span of years, Nick, Ron, and I have, but we finally finished it up. We're dropping all of them to you there to have for a big opening early Christmas present. And then at the end of the year, we've got something super special with our friends from Tis the Podcast. You should check out their show. If you're into Christmas movies, they talk about them year round. They do a great job with it. They were on last year's Year Ender with us, and we had them on for Rare Exports, which was one of our great episodes. And we got them on this year to end of the year with New Year's Evil, which is just a personal favorite of mine. It's how I spend New Year's Eve. I watch that movie every year. And so it's something you should check out. So that's all coming up in 2020. That'll round us up. And then 2021, we'll get back to kind of a normal life. We'll go back to our bi-weekly schedule and stuff. But Nate, you're now part of the fold, and you and I are going to do something interesting next year. We're going to take a selected look at the Star Trek franchise.
Yes.
We're not going to tease it all out here, but you and I have decided, there's a ton of Star Trek films, but we're going to kind of pick and choose like a film that represents the original cast well, a film from the Next Generation cast, and a film from the J.J. Abrams verse of the cast, and we may throw in a couple of extras along the way too.
Yes.
But that's going to be a lot of fun to get into in 2021 with you.
That's going to be exciting. I mean, for those who don't know me, I am a massive Trekkie. Before I got into sports, before I got into history, before I got into everything that I enjoy, there was Star Trek. My dad took me to see Star Trek the Motion Picture when I was 3 years old, and I was hooked ever since.
Yeah, this is a big one for you, and this is going to be fun for me because when you had to pick sides in the playground, I most assuredly picked Star Wars, and it wasn't that I was anti-Trek, but I just didn't.
Well,
I watched the old series, some growing up. I watched, I saw Wrath of Khan, Search for Spock, and Voyage Home in theaters with my family.
There's certainly people put the Star Trek rivalry as a rivalry. It's a mutual respect thing. Trekkies still enjoy Star Wars. People like Star Wars can still appreciate Star Trek. So yes.
Exactly. But it'll be fun because, again, not being the super fan of something, to have one on the show will be a blast to talk about as we get into stuff in 2021. A lot more stuff coming here from Filmstrip, folks, and the way to get it is to subscribe. Go to filmstrippodcast.com. Everywhere podcasts are found, you can find our links there. Apple, Google, Spotify, iHeartRadio. We're all over all of those. Subscribe. If you can leave us a review on Apple, that helps the show a lot. We appreciate that. You can follow the show's social media at FilmstripPod on Twitter and Instagram. And you can also follow us on Facebook at Filmstrip Podcast if you want to see the show posts and stuff from the host from time to time and what we've got going on. All kinds of cool stuff. It's been a massive year for us here on Filmstrip. We're doing a ton of shows. A lot of it because, hey, like the rest of you, we all kind of got stuck working from home for a long time. We didn't have anything else we could possibly do, so we decided to double up and do a lot of shows. We hope you've enjoyed them, and we really appreciate your support and feedback. It's going to be an even more fun year as we turn the corner on the year and go into 2021. So, Nate, thanks again for joining me on this episode. And, folks, we appreciate you listening as well. So until next time, for Nate, I'm Jay. We We appreciate you listening to Film Strip.
Thank you for listening to Film Strip. You can find more episodes on our website, filmstrippodcast.com. The Film Strip theme music is produced and performed by Frozen Lake 121. All content used or discussed in these podcast episodes is the property of the respective owners and used under the Fair Use Act, Section 504, C2, Title 17.